listening to the Shared Security Podcast with Tom Eston and Scott Wright, exploring the trust you put in people, apps, and technology.
Hosted by Scott Wright, the Streetwise Security Coach, and Tom Eston, penetration tester and ethical hacker. And sponsored by Security Perspectives, your source for tailored security awareness training and assessment solutions. We bring you stories, advice, and tips to help you make better risk decisions because nobody else can make them for you.
Episode 55. If Mark Zuckerberg can have his Twitter account hacked, so can you. Da da da.
Hello and welcome to the Shared Security Podcast, episode number 55 for July 6th, 2015. I'm Scott Wright, the Streetwise Security Coach, and I'm here as usual with Tom Eston, the guy who I think is rumored to have hacked his Pebble watch to create a giant GPS art image of LeBron James on the Cleveland streets, and without even leaving his house, apparently. So.
Yeah, I can't believe you told everybody about that,
yeah.
Scott.
Well, I mean, you're always posting up your pictures of your runs, you know, and going, what does that look like? Oh, yeah, okay. Wasn't sure if you're trying to draw art on the streets or not, but anyway.
Are you stalking me on social media?
Well, when I can, you know. I don't know if it's
okay.
actually true, but it makes a good intro. So how are you doing today, Tom?
I'm doing great, and as you've probably heard, and everybody in the world has heard, the Cleveland Cavaliers are the NBA champions for 2016. Just want to throw that out there.
Sorry, I can't hear you. What did you say?
Basketball, Cleveland Cavaliers.
Yeah. Well, wait till the Blue Jays play the Indians again. We'll see.
Right.
Have another.
And the Indians are, they're on a streak too. So.
Well, no, they're not anymore. Apparently, I heard the Blue Jays broke it.
Yeah. They did, but. You know,
yeah, well,
it's okay.
Yeah, well, we have budgets up here, you know.
That's right. Yeah, there are those things in Canada.
Yep, and our dollar, of course, doesn't go as far, so that's another reason why we don't get the good players.
Well, that's right. Yeah. Well.
Anyways, so I think this could be a sort of a record-breaking episode in terms of the number of stories we have had since our last our last recording. So maybe in the interest of time, we probably won't be able to cover them all, but we could just jump right in and do the potpourri of stories and see how it ends up.
Yeah, that sounds good. We got a lot to talk about, and of course, there's never a dull moment in the world of security.
Yes, and across all types of security, right? So privacy, Internet of Things, social media, we got it all. So speaking of social media, why don't we jump in with a little story about how Mark Zuckerberg got hacked?
Yeah, this is a great story. So if you've seen the news over the last couple weeks, Mr. Mark Zuckerberg, who is the founder of Facebook, right? So everybody knows who Mark is, had his Twitter account hacked. And if you, we'll have the article in the show notes, but his password was da, which is, D-A-D-A-D-A, which doesn't sound like a really secure password.
You don't think so?
Was easily gusted. No. And so, again, we go back to the same thing we've always been talking about of ensuring that you have a complex password that is not easily guessed and making sure that that password is different for every site that you use. So some of the research, now people don't know exactly how someone was able to get his password, but one of the theories is that one of the recent password breaches. So you've heard about the LinkedIn breach and some of the others. Mr. Zuckerberg was a member of those sites as well. So there's a good possibility that he was using that same password on, say, a site like LinkedIn, and then it just happened to be used on Twitter as well.
Yeah, so I think that is probably what people have agreed is likely to have happened, and I guess because that breach happened quite a while ago, back in originally in 2012, I think, and it seems like Zuckerberg hasn't really used his Twitter account that much since then, and so he probably hadn't changed it if he was using the same password at the time of the original LinkedIn breach. It makes sense. If he was using the same password across all his accounts, the Twitter account probably hasn't been used since then. He probably never thought to change it. So it's kind of it's a lesson learned for all of us.
Yep, definitely. So again, go back to all the things we've always been saying about passwords and change them and ensure they're unique and use a password manager.
Yeah, it sort of also brings up another little interesting thing I've been thinking about as I've heard stories about the breaches and the announcements. A couple of things happened. I don't know if we have the stories on it this week, but Carbonite and I think GoToMyPC also. They had little incidents where they would send out all of their entire user base saying, we've noticed some suspicious activity. We think you should change your password, or we're going to force you to change your password. Like, if that happens every time there's a major security breach and somebody starts pounding on people's user IDs and passwords on different sites, it's going to get really annoying.
Oh, completely. Yeah. I could just imagine.
All that to say, we're telling you change your password anyway, no matter how annoying it sounds.
Exactly.
It's not a bad idea, though, when you do hear about a breach that, if for any possible reason you think maybe it could be somehow tied to your passwords, change passwords on any affected sites. So,
exactly.
Cool. All right. Well, now that we've got that taken care of, there's a site I came across I just wanted to mention on the podcast, which I thought was kind of neat. It goes back to some of the other tools we've seen, like EchoSec, which is a cool one for zeroing in geographically on social media posts like Twitter and Flickr and others. But there is one now called 1milliontweetmap.com. It's all spelled out like 1 million tweet map. And it has an interesting view. It's only for Twitter, but because everything in Twitter pretty much is public, there's not a lot of filtering, so you see everything. You probably don't necessarily see accurate geographical information, but it could be, within maybe a few hundred miles, wherever your ISP point of presence sort of pops out sometimes. If you don't have the GPS stuff right in the posts, you can see what's kind of being tweeted in a geographical area. And it basically does, as it says, it tracks the last 1 million tweets and it plots them geographically with sort of clusters combined into larger dots, etc. So, and you can also filter using this tool based on hashtags or keywords, which makes it kind of interesting for surveillance purposes.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I actually started zooming into just, the area where I live, and I was fascinated with some of the tweets. And again, going back to, geotagging and some other things we've talked about with privacy. And if you don't want your location to be shared, you can turn those settings off in Twitter. But a lot of people just, either don't care or don't mind their location being shared, or maybe they just don't know about it either. But it's eye-opening, to say the least.
It is, and it's something that's it's a little bit addictive when you start playing with these things, right? To zoom in and do searches and stuff like that. So for those of you who are bored at work, you can play around with this 1 million tweet map.com. Hopefully there's no treats in there, but you never know. It's a cool tool. So moving on, more on Facebook. Why you shouldn't share links on Facebook. Maybe you could dig into this one, Tom.
Yeah, this one, this is some interesting research. And if you want to go into a lot more detail, we'll have the article in the show notes. But in the nutshell, essentially, any link that you share through Facebook Messenger can be accessed through a couple data harvesting techniques that are available to Facebook developers. And as we've talked about on the show before, really anybody can become a Facebook developer. It's really taking your existing Facebook account, requesting developer access, and now you can all of a sudden have access to the developer API and write applications and all that fun stuff. And so what this researcher found was, by doing some manipulations of some of the queries that he was making, and then with some scripts that he wrote, he was able to enumerate some of the unique identifiers that each URL that you post on Facebook through what you think is a private message to your friends can actually be enumerated and found. So he wrote a script to basically enumerate, just these. Essentially, it's a unique identifier for each of these messages, and you can get those URLs back. What I found fascinating, though, was he did a little bit of sampling of just information that he was able to glean off of some of these URLs that were coming back. And so, for example, if you look at a typical URL these days, just because of keyword tagging and, the way that search engines categorize information, URLs nowadays are very descriptive. Just look at the URLs from the podcast, right? We actually put in a lot of information in that URL so Google and other search engines can pick things up. But he was able to find people's names, location, their language, attachments or pictures, application or game data, including, purchase amount of certain things within games, usernames, other things. And then what I find fascinating is secret links or hidden keys. So these are things such as private links to documents on services like Dropbox or Google Drive, links to hidden pages, websites, beta environments, all kinds of information that really should be protected and shouldn't be easily accessible. But I think it's just fascinating research. And to top it all off, Facebook has come back and said this really isn't a security issue. There's really no way to fix it. This is just how Facebook's service works. So take that for what it is, but some fascinating research.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't, as much as you say I could be a developer, I don't think I could, because I don't really understand all the details of the technology there. But it's interesting just looking at it from a distance and saying, so why only the links are, these private links are accessible, but not other objects within Facebook?
Well, it all depends on privacy settings is the biggest thing, except for messages within Facebook Messenger seems to be one of the things that you can't really put permissions on that because it's deemed to be private, right? So I'm sending a message to you on Facebook. I'm under the assumption that only you can read that, right?
But they don't enforce any access control on it.
No, there really isn't any way to do that because it's a one-to-one conversation. And I think they keep it open because you know how you can send messages to a group of people through Facebook Messenger.
Oh, yeah.
They may have kind of a design issue that they at one point maybe considered, and they took the option of, we're just going to make it open. But because, exactly right, you can't query someone's posts unless they're set to public. And that's the one thing. There was an issue, I think it was last year, that a researcher found that there was a bug that you could enumerate basically, anything that, even if it was privately posted, and Facebook went ahead and fixed that. But this issue is specific to Messenger.
It's interesting. Sort of in the end, it makes you think that it's almost like when you create a video on YouTube that you don't want to make private, but you give it an obfuscated link or something like that, a one-time link that nobody else would really be able to guess, but you can share it with people. So it's not really protected. Anybody who gets that link can see it. So it's a similar idea, right? It's some random data that if you figured out a way to locate that data, you would be able to access it.
Right. In this case, it's just enumerating that data. So it's essentially just it's a number. Right. So if you can just increment or decrement that number through a script or a tool, it's pretty easy to find lots and lots of URLs that way.
Cool. I suppose lots of attackers are doing that.
Right. So the lesson here, just something to be aware of, right? Just to, not to say that someone would become a target of this. It's so hard to define who a target can be these days, right? Because we also have, large governments, I know here in the United States, that are looking at everybody's information. So there is that angle, right?
Mm.
But there's also, people that become targets through a dedicated hacker that wants to get into your information for whatever reason. It's just something to be aware of, private links, things like Google Doc links that you're sharing with someone that you have maybe some sensitive information you're talking about, or maybe information you just don't want exposed. Just something to consider, and think about other means of maybe sending that link. It's just something to be aware of. Like I said, I don't think it's a huge concern, but
no, it's definitely something that we all have to kind of keep in mind. Good. So let's move to the Internet of Things. Back to our old favorite cameras, closed circuit TV cameras. So this guy, in an article on the Hacker News, where we'll have the link, bought a closed circuit TV camera, actually presumably for a security application, from Amazon, a store on Amazon, I guess. I'm not sure if it was direct from Amazon or through an affiliate, but it was either he or a friend of his was trying to set this up, and when he was helping them, he noticed that on the console control panel page, some of the options didn't seem to appear properly in the area they were exposed to. And so he thought, well, maybe they just screwed up some of the code or whatever. And he went in and looked at the source code of the page, I think, and found something unusual there. It was a link to get some information from some other kind of suspicious looking URL. Turns out it was an iframe trying to grab information from what I think has been reputed to be a known dangerous website, right, where malware had been distributed from before. And so it sort of points to the fact that this device had already been compromised before it was even purchased. So that kind of a thing is kind of scary, because the way it was done, I think, would allow the attacker to essentially put anything they wanted at that server, and it would get pulled down by the camera. Is that right?
Yep, that's exactly right. It's scary. I've actually read more stories of just manufacturers, and not just Amazon either, but I've read a story about someone going to a Best Buy and buying, a cheap Internet of Thing device, and they found out that later that it had malicious code that was embedded in the firmware. So this type of thing is pretty frequent.
Yeah, I mean, that goes all the way back to the picture frames, USB picture frames, where they used to come with flash memory was already corrupted with some kind of infection that was going to try to infect your PCs as well. So yeah, the supply chain security, we call it, right, is how secure is all the steps. How secure are the steps that products take from their first manufacture through distribution? So it's a tricky thing.
It is tricky, and it's tough, because so many of those different parts, you could be an American company or a Canadian company, and all your manufacturing takes place, overseas, like in China or some other country. Mm-hmm. And how much control do they really have on the process that's used to, build the product? And, like in this case, built into the firmware, you really have to, a company really has to look at their QA process and ensuring that, and we've seen these things with laptops as well. Lenovo had a huge issue, with the Superfish vulnerability, and I think continues to have issues with all the different third parties that, build things, for these computer manufacturers. It's a very similar situation.
Yeah, and it's sort of a little hint here for anybody who wanted to start a new business, doing supply chain security assessments, testing quality of security of new products would be probably a growing market in the future.
Yeah, it is. It is. And that's something that I know, just, the little plug to Veracode, but that's what my team has been doing, more of that type of work where, companies are coming to us that have applications embedded into these systems, and they are concerned with, how are they developed? And, could some other developer that had access to the source code put something into these devices? So
is that from a product sales point of view? Like the organizations that are hiring you are actually selling the products, or is it just stuff that's in their network, in their own production environment?
So these are companies that manufacture the hardware
Okay.
and essentially sell that, and as part of their developer software development lifecycle, they have concerns because a lot of the code that they write isn't necessarily done by the company,
Right.
right? They outsource a lot of that code these days, and a lot of it is overseas, and so they want extra assurance that nothing malicious has been put into the hardware,
Yep.
as just part of doing good security.
Yep, that's a great idea. I'm glad somebody's doing that. Good for you guys.
Yep, we're seeing a lot more of it.
And that, on a similar note, next story we were going to talk about is another Internet of Things horror story, and it's actually came from Reddit. Now, the authenticity, you have to sort of look at it and say,
Reddit.
okay, it's Reddit, yeah. So like nobody ever posts anything made up on Reddit, but it's probably it sounds reliable anyway. But the story goes that somebody had purchased a camera. I don't remember the brand, but it may actually be in the link that we have to the Reddit post. But they'd bought this camera and configured it, and then decided they didn't like it or whatever, and they returned it back to the store. And then one of the things they had configured on it initially was alerts via email whenever there was motion on the camera or some events on the camera. And so a little while after they returned the camera, they started getting emails with alerts saying that there was motion on their camera, but they didn't have a camera anymore. And so when they looked into it, it was the new owner of the camera, and they were getting, or maybe not the new owner, but a newly assigned camera that just happened to be mapped to their email. And they were getting these alerts, and lo and behold, they could actually view the scene on the other end of the camera without that person presumably knowing that anyone else was watching, which is a little scary.
I love that, though. That's just we may have talked about this before with mobile applications. This is a typical problem we see in mobile applications that link the hardware to the application, and that's just a bad idea, because what happens if you sell your device or whatever product you bought? And most people do sell them.
Mm-hmm.
They don't just throw them away these days. They may throw them on eBay or at a garage sale or what have you. But there was a similar issue with a mobile application I remember that got in some hot water, that if you sold your phone and another person installed the application on that phone, it would actually automatically link to the previous owner.
To their account in the database. Correct. They had, yeah. Cool.
Because they used the hardware identifier on the hardware, which you can't change. So yeah, just really bad.
The story was probably the same as Facebook's. It's not a bug; it's a feature.
Yes, it's a feature. It's added value, or they call it value add in the business world. Right?
Yeah. So anyway, the bottom line on this story is consider carefully what happened or will happen to devices that you buy from retail stores, or even online, because if anybody owned it before you, they may have configured something in it that could have impacts on your privacy, or vice versa. Anything that you've configured or done with the device might end up being visible to somebody later. So I guess what you want to do is, if you return a device, you want to delete all your account information from the account, not only wiping the device if that's possible.
Yeah, well, the biggest thing too is, factory reset, right? So anything that you sell, you should always reset it back to factory default, especially a router or, anything that you're going to resell. And also for computers, right? So if you're selling your iPhone or you're selling your laptop, anything like that, make sure you're erasing the hard drive. There's tons of utilities and things out there that will, show you how to do that. You can just Google it, but always erase your data and reset everything before you sell it.
Great idea. So, what else are we looking at in this episode, Tom?
Oh, banking and two-factor authentication. Or I'll say biometrics and two-factor authentication.
Yeah. So we talked about fingerprints or thumbprints a while ago as not necessarily being the best solution for authentication on devices, right?
Right, exactly. And but we're seeing this large increase, especially in the financial industry, that banks are now starting to use the fingerprint scanning on your mobile phone, and even using facial recognition as a way to authenticate banking users all through the mobile phone now.
Mm-hmm. So this is a good story from the New York Times. I think that we have that. It was kind of surprising to me, but it looks like they've identified a number of U.S. banks, at least, that are really actively starting programs where they're either trial or in production with multiple, well, biometrics at least, but in some cases multiple biometrics or a password and a
Yep.
biometric, which is, I think, a good idea. I don't think you want to rely just on biometrics because of some of the things that we've talked about before, where they're vulnerable
Yep.
or have weaknesses. But I think, from my point of view, ideally, if you had a couple of biometrics, a thumbprint and a facial or a retina scan, that could probably go a long way to, dealing with some of the weaknesses.
Yeah, and the other piece of that too is that the banks haven't quite, gotten rid of the password. They still will require, you to put your password in for, say like a banking transfer, right? So maybe you might log into your mobile app with, the built-in, fingerprint scanner on your iPhone, but they'll still request a password as kind of almost like a second layer, I'd call it, before a sensitive transaction happens.
Yep. So it's actually it's kind of interesting and encouraging that there's progress being made in that area.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think biometric technology has also just gotten better over the years. I remember when I used to work in banking, it was very archaic with, there was talks of, we'd love to give some customers, fingerprint, biometrics, but the talk at the time was, well, we'd have to send these USB devices out to all of our customers, and the costs associated with that. And now they don't have to do that because everybody has a fingerprint reader built into their phone now. So we're seeing more businesses, not just banks, that are just taking advantage of the technology that people are just naturally carrying around with them now.
Yeah, and I think, in the article, I think it even mentions banks are just getting fed up with all the problems of passwords and the weaknesses
Yeah.
of them alone, right? So,
Yeah, just the breaches, breach after breach. There has to be something better, and I think two-factor and biometrics is not perfect, which we can talk about in the next article about why text messages for two-factor authentication may not be the best way to do things anymore, because there are attacks on that type of technology as well. But anything can be better than the traditional way of just passwords.
yep, yep,
I'm glad we're seeing more things.
yes, and it's more for us to talk about.
That's right.
Speaking of that, you mentioned the two-factor authentication using text messages.
Yeah, so this is one of those things that just over the years. So what do we mean by two-factor authentication with text message? So if you're a member of Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or any of these sites that they will send you a one-time password over your phone through a text message, and then you type that number into the web application, and then it authenticates you. And usually this is tied to your password as well. So you're going to put your password in, and you're going to put the text message number that you receive to authenticate. The problem that we're seeing is that there's more attacks recently on SMS text messages and that whole infrastructure. So this is an infrastructure that's been around for decades, right? Kind of the basis of cell phone technology. Text messages was kind of always part of that. But what we're seeing now, which is some of these attacks, not just by state-sponsored governments, but also there have been some pretty high-profile hacks that are using different techniques such as social engineering to say redirect someone's text messages on their phone to another phone. by calling up Verizon and saying, hey, I'm the device owner. I need to switch out my SIM card. Can you do this for me? And this is a pretty common attack now, where now text messages and that second piece of authentication can be redirected to somebody else. And then this is how some Twitter accounts and other things are being hacked, because they're finding that this method really isn't secure anymore. The other piece to this too is that there are devices that can be purchased now to set up basically what they are is fake cell phone towers that can intercept text messages and telephone calls. They're basically called IMSI catchers. You can Google that for more information. This is something that debuted a few years ago. I actually saw a talk at DEF CON where they demonstrated this technology, where everybody in the room could see, you could send messages to basically somebody else, the speaker's phone, and on the screen you could see every message that everybody in the room was sending to it, because they had one of these fake cell towers at the conference.
Wow.
And this was several years ago. So you can imagine, the technology now, they've really perfected that, and it really just is exploiting the weakness in kind of the telephone network and cell towers.
Yeah, I think there's a subtle but important point to make in this one too, and that is the technology used for the voice, the digital voice data, basically, that's being sent over the telephone networks, is different than the technology for the texts. It's the radios in the phones basically send data for texts a different way than they do for your voice data, and the voice data gets scrambled, so you can't sit around with a scanner anymore and listen to people's cell phone conversations. But the text data is actually less secure.
Right. Exactly. So some of the recommendations, is, hopefully companies are starting to realize this and will move away from using SMS as that two-factor type authentication. And really the best way to do it now, and it has always been, is actually in the form of a token. So you've heard of RSA tokens that generates kind of a random one-time code that changes every few seconds. And then there's some crazy math on the back end that's used to correlate that. Also, you've heard of Google Authenticator. So these are an app that you install on your phone. There's a company called Duo Security that has something very similar. That way, you're not actually getting something sent to you over a potentially insecure network. You're generating a code on your own that's not connected to anything that you have in your hand. You're physically holding it, and then you can put that into the site when it prompts you. And that's a much more secure way of doing it.
Yeah, there's definitely some good technologies for as alternatives to the text messaging, so we're not stuck there.
Right. But, so hopefully we see some changes, especially with Twitter. I know that's one of the biggest ones, and Facebook. They're all doing that as well, because several years ago that was really one of the best options, and it is the most convenient for most users as well.
Yeah. And that was in a Wired magazine article, right? So we'll have that in the show notes. Hi, this is Scott Wright, the Streetwise Security Coach. As you can tell from listening to this podcast, I have a passion for helping people to understand security risks, and I want people to work efficiently and securely. I love to talk about the wild and scary incidents, threats, and vulnerabilities that make headlines, like ransomware. However, the one thing that really strikes me when I speak to people about basic information security issues is that it can be hard for most employees and managers to stay up to date on which risks are important to their business operations. While IT staff and management may understand the consequences of various threats, they often don't have time to spend on developing a security awareness program that fits their team's culture, policies, and terminology. This is where I can help. I can deliver everything from an off-the-shelf security awareness presentation for small teams to auditable e-learning and phishing assessment programs. Often, managers who want to get their teams up to speed quickly will ask me to do an initial live Streetwise Kickstart session to get their security awareness program started. This is often followed by an implementation of streetwise security awareness initiatives such as computer-based training and ongoing assessment programs. In the end, after initiating a streetwise security awareness program, teams are more connected and collaborate more on security, knowing that they will be well informed about emerging threats. This lets teams work confidently but securely without overburdening them with overkill security measures. The bottom line is, if you can prove that all staff are informed about information security risks and is making good security decisions, there's less need for elaborate and costly technology safeguards. So why not start with a live streetwise kickstart session for your employees before you become the next ransomware headline? Please visit www.securityperspectives.com and fill in the convenient inquiry forms on any of the solution pages. After submitting your request, I also recommend that you sign up for the Streetwise Security News newsletter so you can stay informed on security news stories that are easily shareable. You can also call me at 613-693-0997 and leave a voicemail message. If you mention that you heard about us through the Shared Security podcast, I will give you a 10% discount on a half-day Streetwise Kickstart session. I look forward to working with you. Now back to our regularly scheduled Shared Security podcast. Now we're going to go back a year to some old news, but it's interesting because it got a lot of interest when we sort of reposted it on I think on our Facebook page, right?
Yeah. This was about some research from Google's security team on how security experts and non-experts stay safe online.
Yeah, so there was a conference, I think, where this was presented in 2015, in the summer last year, where there's some subtle differences between, they basically had polled non-security experts and security experts on what they do to stay secure online. And they put the results, the top 5, kind of side by side and contrasted them. And it's quite interesting. So I think...
Yeah, it is.
Do you have any comments on it?
Yeah, I was just pulling that up. What I find fascinating is most non-security experts feel that antivirus software is the number one way to stay safe online, and that didn't even come up on the list of security experts' top 5. And again, I think it's because there is maybe a false sense of security with antivirus, and most people have had that hammered into their brains for years that you got to have antivirus, and then as a security professional and of course as a penetration tester, we get past antivirus all the time, and we see the weaknesses, and we say, yeah, it's good to have, you should have it, but don't rely on it as your ultimate defense. Goes back to the defense in depth philosophy.
Which makes it interesting in terms of whether or not it should be number one. I think the security practitioners probably assume that it's there to start with, catching all the old vulnerabilities, right? The old and the old threats that we know exist, and especially the worms and things like that, right? Where it doesn't rely on people's actions. It just, if there's a vulnerability there, these things are going to attack it. So you kind of, I think, still need security software there. I wouldn't necessarily call it antivirus because there's a lot of different ways that security software works now, from signatures or heuristics or different methods. But I think that's an interesting difference there, and that the security experts didn't even put it in the top 5 is quite interesting. What I noticed in the list of the security experts' top 5, 4 of them related to passwords and authentication.
Yeah, the passwords, that's one, I think, common ground between non-security experts and security experts, is that, there is a strong push to, have strong and unique passwords. Mm-hmm. On the non-security expert side, I found it fascinating that, use strong passwords and change passwords frequently were the only 2, while security professionals say, use unique passwords, strong passwords, and 2-factor authentication, and use a password manager. So
it's all about the passwords, folks.
That's right.
Until we go to biometric. But it's an interesting chart, so worth having a look at.
Yeah, definitely check it out. You may find it just fascinating, some of that research.
Yep. And I guess we got a couple of minutes. We'll cover a couple of other stories. I guess one that we don't have a link for at the moment, but we may be able to find one on, is the Symantec breach that occurred sometime in the past week. It wasn't a breach, but it was more of a vulnerability discovered by a Google researcher who discovered that a lot of Symantec's security products are built with a common kernel or core that happen to have a significant vulnerability in it. And so they're essentially trying to scramble now, getting people to update all their stuff.
Yeah, this was a big one. It affected pretty much most of Symantec's security suite, everything from like their endpoint protection to, everything else that they sell. So, kind of a big deal. If you have Symantec products, you should hopefully are looking into that.
And it's a tricky thing. I think, Symantec's a veteran security company. You'd think they would know better. But I think the problem is faced by all security vendors in one form or another. And that is, as you try to add security functionality, every time you do that, you're adding a bit of complexity and possibly adding to what we call the attack surface, right? Something that the attackers can try to get at. And it makes it more complex to try and find the weaknesses, as Veracode tries to do for their clients, right? But it's not always possible to find them in a timely manner.
Right, exactly, and this is another reason that I know we've talked a little bit about bug bounties and those types of things that more companies are doing, of ensuring that you have a disclosure policy. If someone does a security research does find a vulnerability in your product or your application or something like that, that you have a program that allows someone to contact you and you can discuss and hopefully remediate the issue before it goes public, right? And so I think that's a good thing that companies can do, especially large companies like Symantec and others. Hopefully they have a bug bounty program, but that's something that I think is a good thing.
Yep.
To get ahead of this stuff.
For sure. And Symantec is not the only one. Even historically, there have been others, security software companies that have had major security problems themselves, which is kind of ironic, but that's just the world we live in.
It is. Yeah, everything is hackable. That's my philosophy. Yep. Even the security stuff.
Yep. And a couple of other things. I forgot to cover the one other IoT thing that we had, which was basically a security researcher who had purchased something from Amazon. I think it was a smart electrical socket, so you could control it from your iPhone, basically to turn your lights on and off, or anything that's plugged into a socket remotely. Anyway, the security researcher had purchased it and discovered that it had really bad authentication or bad security of some kind, and posted a review on Amazon's site, because that's where he purchased it from. And lo and behold, got a bit of a harassing or threatening note from the manufacturer saying, please change your review to be something positive, or else people are going to get fired, which is a little bit of a strange way to react to this. Rather than a bug bounty, we have a posse coming out after you.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting.
So anyway, that was just something that we're probably going to see more of, but it really is not the right way to go about reacting to someone who's taken the time to point out an area where you could improve, right?
You see that all the time, though. There's still issues of companies sending their lawyers after security researchers for wanting to do the right thing and saying, "Hey, I found this issue in your application, your product." Sometimes they don't even want money. They're just like, "Here, we want to let you know that," and the next thing they know, they get a cease and desist in the mail. It's crazy.
My favorite was a few years ago, the story from was it Oracle? I think somebody hacked some Oracle product and published it, or did some kind of a disclaimer or a disclosure to them, and the chief security officer sent them a cease and desist notice, and then posted a note, I think, saying anybody who has shown evidence of hacking our products will be cut off from all our product sales. It's like,
oh wow,
really?
Wow.
I think we covered it in one of our episodes a couple of years ago.
I think we did. Yeah.
Just not how not to
Too
react.
funny.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And one last story, just related to hospital devices. We've talked about them a few times, being exposed on the internet, and sometimes now we've got new threats attacking them. There's evidence of the Conficker worm, which is from 2008, I think.
Oh my gosh, it goes way back.
Yeah. So, a technology that is still usable for attacking devices on the internet. And essentially it's being used to collect personal information or hospital health records from patients who have been either subjected to tests using these devices or whatever. But that seems totally incredible, but it's on ThreatPost as a story.
Wow. I just can't believe I'm hearing that word again, Conficker.
Yeah, no. It takes you back.
Next thing I'll hear is code red.
Yeah, that's before we even started podcasting. Back in the old days, we used to,
Yeah, I used to fight the code red worm on my network.
Well, what's interesting is I remember a couple of things about Conficker, because that was when I started. It was coincidental, but I had just started doing the Honeystick project, where I was dropping USB drives with sort of special files on them to determine whether people would load them in and if they understood the risks of malware. And then, of course, a few months later, Conficker comes out, and it was like transmitted by USB drives. There were actually three sort of things that it leveraged, that worm. It leveraged the USB drives being writable, and you could start, sort of auto start as you plugged in the device, right? Any software that was on it. Plus, it took advantage of any computers on the network nearby that had admin with no password as the account name, right? And also it took advantage of unpatched versions of Internet Explorer, I believe. But that second one of admin and no password kind of sounds familiar. Maybe these devices have similar characteristics in terms of how they're configured, and that's how it's being used.
That's exactly what happens. I mean, I'm looking at the article here, and they're talking about, Windows XP and, Windows 7 systems. So, I mean, we're talking, and a lot of this, I mean, hospitals, because they mentioned, a hospital IoT device. I mean, a lot of hospitals don't upgrade their equipment because, we're talking about life support systems and other things that,
why would you want to have up-to-date software when you're going into surgery, right? No, but
exactly.
It was more that they didn't want them to be rebooting in the middle of surgery as the system decides, how that randomly start to say, oh, we have an update now, let's go.
Yeah, hospital networks are just fascinating with just some of the ancient equipment that is used, but it's understandable why you don't want to touch it, because if it's not broke, why fix it or upgrade?
It's definitely a normal reaction. Yeah.
Yep.
However, we need more people looking at these things to make our medical devices a little more secure, obviously.
We're very busy.
We have jobs, Tom.
Yes, we do.
All right. Well, along the way, somewhere along the way, I was going to put in a little plug for Security Perspectives, and I think I'll go back in time and do that somewhere before one of our other mentions here. But we want to thank everybody for listening this episode. It's been fun having you, and I guess any parting words, Tom?
No, just anybody has any feedback or topics they'd like for us to discuss, you can send us an email at feedback@sharedsecurity.net. We're also on Twitter, and we're on Facebook, and we have so many different ways of get a hold of us.
You could get a hold of us just about any way. And also, I guess, I don't know if Tom's going. Anybody going to DEF CON Black Hat this year?
I am not going this year. I had to make a last-minute decision not to go because I had a business trip that was
the one year I'm going to be going and you're not. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, right.
Maybe next year.
Next year.
So, yeah.
Got it.
Anyways, okay, well, thanks a lot, everybody, and we will talk to you next episode.
Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.